Welcome, dear traveller. Find a comfortable place, somewhere soft and still, and let the weight of your body settle slowly into whatever holds you. Let your shoulders fall, let your jaw unclench, let your breath come easy and low, without effort, without rush. Tonight we're going somewhere ancient. Long before the first human footstep ever pressed into soil. Long before the first stone was carved, or the first fire was kindled in a cave. Long before the oceans held the shapes they hold today, or the mountains wore the names we have given them, there was a world unlike any you've ever seen. A world of strange and magnificent creatures, a world still finding its form, still learning what life could become. Tonight, we trace the long and winding path of the dinosaurs, not just the dinosaurs you know from museums and picture books, though we will visit them too, but the full sweep of their story, how they arose from chaos, how they spread across every corner of the ancient earth, how they grew into giants and shrank into feathered wonders, how they ruled for over 160 million years, shaping the very ground we now walk upon. This is a long journey, a deep journey, a quiet journey. So breathe gently now and let us begin together. We want to thank you for supporting us, and it would mean so much if you could support the channel by leaving a like and subscribing to help us keep this channel going. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Anyways, back to the video. Before we can understand the dinosaurs, we must first understand the world they inherited, and to understand that world, we must go back even further, back to a time when the very concept of a dinosaur had not yet entered the story of a life on Earth. Close your eyes and imagine, if you can, a single landmass. One enormous supercontinent called Pangaea, drifting slowly through warm, shallow seas under a sky thick with greenhouse gases. The air is rich with moisture. The temperatures are high near the equator and merely warm at the poles. The world is not yet divided into the continents you know. There is no Atlantic Ocean, no Indian Ocean as we understand it. The Americas are fused to Europe and Africa. Antarctica sits joined to what will one day become Australia. Everything is connected, and everything is vast. This is the late Permian period, roughly 252 million years ago, and the Earth has just survived the most catastrophic extinction event in its long and complicated history. The Great Dying, as scientists have come to call it, erased approximately 96% of all marine species and around 70% of all land vertebrates. The oceans grew acidic and choked. Vast volcanic provinces in what is now Siberia erupted for hundreds of thousands of years, filling the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide in quantities that the biosphere simply could not absorb. Temperatures spiked, the ozone layer weakened, the ocean stratified, their deep layers becoming anoxic, devoid of the oxygen that complex life requires. And yet life survived, not all of it, not most of it, but enough. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, the survivors found themselves in a world stripped almost bare. The ancient forests were gone. The seas were quiet and half empty. The land was colonized mostly by opportunists, small, fast-reproducing creatures that could eat almost anything and live almost anywhere. Among those survivors were the archosaurs, a broad group of reptiles that would, over the coming tens of millions of years, diverge into two great lineages. One lineage would eventually give rise to the crocodilians, animals still alive today, largely unchanged in their fundamental body plan. The other lineage would give rise, through a long and winding evolutionary path, to the dinosaurs and ultimately to the birds. But in those early Triassic years, immediately after the Great Dying, the archosaurs were neither rulers nor giants. They were small, they were cautious, they were survivors in the truest sense, living in the shadows of a recovering world, eating insects and small animals and whatever vegetation had managed to resprout from the devastated soil. Breathe with that image for a moment. The world is quiet now. The Great Dying has passed. The air is warm and hazy. Small creatures move through low scrubland under a sun that is not quite the same hue as the one you know. The recovery has begun, and it will be slow, and it will be beautiful in its slowness. The early Triassic is a time of rebuilding. The ecosystems are simple, the food webs are shallow, but life, as it always does, is reaching. Reaching upward, reaching outward, reaching into every available niche with the persistent and patient urgency that is evolution's great engine. Among the earliest archosaurs to emerge in the Triassic were the proterochampsids, small semi-aquatic reptiles with long snouts and an ambush predator lifestyle not entirely unlike the crocodilians they were related to. Then came the etosaurs, armoured plant-eating creatures that trundled through Triassic forests like ancient living tanks. And then the Rauisuchians, apex predators of the mid-Triassic world, large and powerful and built for pursuit. These creatures are not dinosaurs, but they are the context in which dinosaurs would eventually arise. The world of the Middle Triassic, roughly 240 to 230 million years ago, was beginning to fill back in. The ferns and horsetails that had colonized the post-extinction wastelands were giving way to more complex plant communities. Gymnosperms, the ancient forerunners of today's conifers, were spreading across the landscape. Cycads and seed ferns created the first great forests of the Mesozoic era. Insects were evolving rapidly, filling the air with new forms and behaviours. The seas were recovering too, slowly becoming complex again, though they would never quite regain the extraordinary diversity of the Paleozoic. And somewhere in this recovering world, probably in what is now South America, perhaps in what is today Argentina or southern Brazil, a small group of archosaurs was beginning to diverge from their relatives in a way that would change the story of life on Earth forever. Their legs were shifting. In most reptiles of the time, the legs sprawled outward from the body like a lizard's, a posture that is effective for short bursts of speed but inefficient for sustained locomotion. In this new group, the legs were beginning to move beneath the body, directly below the centre of gravity, in what we call an erect posture. This seemingly simple anatomical shift, hips redesigned to allow the legs to hang straight down rather than splay outward, had enormous consequences. An erect posture is more energetically efficient. It allows for longer strides without the body having to swing from side to side. It frees the chest from the compression that comes with sprawling locomotion, allowing more efficient breathing during movement. It supports greater body mass, and it opens up a whole new range of ecological possibilities. These early proto-dinosaur archosaurs were not yet dinosaurs in the strict sense. They were something in between, more gracile, more nimble, more upright than their sprawling relatives, but not yet possessing all the anatomical hallmarks that paleontologists used to define the Dinosauria. Those hallmarks were still coming, and when they arrived, they would arrive quietly, in a world that was still finding its new equilibrium after the catastrophe of the Great Dying. Let yourself rest with that image. The early Triassic world slowly greening again, small nimble reptiles moving through the underbrush on straightening legs. The ancestors of the most extraordinary animals the Earth has ever known, still small, still cautious, still finding their way in a world they would one day inherit completely. The stage is nearly set, and from somewhere in the ancient soils of Gondwana, the southern portion of the supercontinent Pangaea, the dinosaurs are about to make their entrance. Breathe, settle, the story's just beginning. The Carnian pluvial episode was a critical chapter in the early history of the dinosaurs, and it is worth pausing here to explore it fully, because it is one of the great turning points in the history of life, and one that is still not widely known outside the circles of paleontology. Approximately 233 million years ago, during the Carnian stage of the late Triassic period, the climate of the Earth underwent a dramatic and relatively rapid shift. The world, which had been predominantly dry and arid across much of Pangaea, suddenly became far wetter. Rainfall increased dramatically, deserts bloomed, lakes formed where none had existed before, river systems expanded and shifted. The vegetation of the world changed with almost bewildering speed. Scientists believe this was triggered by a major phase of volcanic activity, specifically by the eruption of the Rangelia Large Igneous Province, a vast flood basalt event that poured enormous quantities of water vapour and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, warming the globe and intensifying the hydrological cycle. For roughly 1 to 2 million years, the world was drenched. And in that wet new world, life exploded. The Carnian pluvial episode is associated with a dramatic diversification of terrestrial ecosystems. New plant communities spread across previously barren regions, new niches opened up, and new animals rose to fill them. Among the animals that rose during and immediately after the Carnian pluvial episode were the true dinosaurs. The earliest confirmed dinosaurs, creatures like Eoraptor lunensis, Herrerasaurus ischigualastensis, and Eodromaeus murphy, all found in the Ischigualasto Formation of Argentina, date to approximately 231 to 228 million years ago, right at or just after the peak of the Carnian pluvial episode. This is not a coincidence. The wet world of the Carnian pluvial episode created conditions in which the ancestors of the dinosaurs, already well suited to efficient locomotion and opportunistic feeding, could spread and diversify rapidly. As the climate shifted and the ecosystem reshuffled, the dinosaurs were in the right place at the right time with the right body plan. But we should not imagine this as a sudden conquest. The earliest dinosaurs were small, no bigger than a large dog or a medium-sized deer. They were not the apex predators of their world. The Rauisuchians still filled that role, and various other archosaur groups occupied most of the major ecological niches on the land. The earliest dinosaurs were, in the ecological sense, minor players, and yet they were persistent, and they were versatile, and they had the erect posture and the efficient locomotion that would serve them so well in the coming years. As you let your breathing slow and deepen, imagine those first dinosaurs moving through the Carnian landscape. Small, quick, lightly built, their feet leaving delicate impressions in the wet mud at the edge of a shallow lake. The sky above them unfamiliar, the stars of the Triassic night arranged in constellations that no human eye has ever seen. The world around them full of sounds that have been silent for 230 million years. The calls of early crocodilomorphs, the rustling of seed ferns in a warm wind, the distant splash of something large in a river no longer on any map. These creatures do not know what they are about to become. They do not know that their descendants will grow to be the largest animals ever to walk on land. They do not know that their lineage will survive 5 more mass extinctions, that their feathered descendants will one day fill the skies of every continent, that their story will be told by creatures who are themselves, in a strange and distant way, the inheritors of the world the dinosaurs built. They are simply alive, moving through the warm Triassic night, breathing, watching, waiting. That is enough for now. The late Triassic period is a fascinating and somewhat underappreciated chapter in the dinosaur story. When most people think of dinosaurs, they think of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, the age of giants, the age of Tyrannosaurus and Brachiosaurus, and the great horned and armoured creatures of the later Mesozoic. The Triassic dinosaurs are smaller, less famous, and far less well represented in popular culture. But they are absolutely essential to understanding everything that came after. Let us spend some time with them now, in that warm and quiet Triassic world, and let their story unfold gently around you as your breathing continues to slow. The major division within the Dinosauria was already established early in their history. Dinosaurs are divided into 2 great groups based on the arrangement of their hip bones. One group, the Saurischia, a name meaning lizard-hipped, has the pubis bone pointing forward, as in most non-dinosaurian reptiles. The other group, the Ornithischia, meaning bird-hipped, has the pubis rotated backward to lie alongside the ischium. Curiously, despite the name, it is the Saurischia, the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, that gave rise to birds. Evolution is full of such happy contradictions. The Saurischia were divided further into 2 major groups: the theropods, which were bipedal carnivores, and the lineage that would ultimately produce birds, and the sauropodomorphs, which were the ancestors of the great long-necked plant-eating giants. In the Triassic, both groups were present, but both were still small and somewhat tentative in their ecological roles. Among the earliest theropods was Eoraptor, discovered in Argentina in the 1990s. Eoraptor was a gracile, lightly built creature about a metre long, with small, serrated teeth and nimble, grasping forelimbs. It was likely an omnivore, eating small animals, insects, and perhaps plant material depending on availability. It moved quickly on 2 legs, its long tail providing balance as it darted through the undergrowth. Herrerasaurus, a contemporary of Eoraptor in the Ischigualasto Formation, was somewhat larger, up to 4 or 5 metres in length, and more clearly a predator, with recurved teeth and powerful grasping hands. Herrerasaurus was one of the largest animals in its ecosystem, though it still lived in the shadow of the great Rauisuchians. Further afield, in what is now North America, the Triassic was giving rise to other early dinosaurs. Calophysis boweri, known from hundreds of beautifully preserved specimens from Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, was a slender, swift theropod about 2 to 3 meters long. Chelophysis lived in large groups, or at least it died in large groups, and the bone beds at Ghost Ranch suggest that populations of these animals were sometimes overwhelmed together, perhaps by drought or by a sudden flood, their remains preserved in layered masses that speak of a shared fate. Coelophysis is one of the best known of all Triassic dinosaurs, and for good reason. The Ghost Ranch specimens are exquisite, preserving fine details of bone and occasional glimpses of what may have been soft tissue impressions. From them, we can reconstruct an animal that was elegant, alert, long-necked, with large eyes well suited for the dim light of early morning or evening hunting. Coelophysis moved with a kind of nervous energy, the energy of a creature that was itself prey as much as predator, that understood through instinct rather than thought that speed and alertness were the only currencies of survival. On the sauropodomorph side of the Triassic, the story is equally interesting. The earlier sauropodomorphs were not the vast, long-necked plant-eaters of later ages. They were small to medium-sized creatures, some of them still partly carnivorous or omnivorous, all of them bipedal or at least capable of bipedal locomotion. Plateosaurus engelharti, from the late Triassic of Europe, was one of the first large dinosaurs. Growing to lengths of 5 to 10 meters, Plateosaurus was a bulk browser, using its long neck to reach vegetation at various heights, its small leaf-shaped teeth well suited for processing plant material. Plateosaurus is known from exceptional specimens across Germany, Switzerland and Scandinavia, and these specimens tell us something fascinating about dinosaur biology. Plateosaurus shows clear evidence of determinate growth, meaning it grew steadily to a genetically determined size, rather than continuing to grow throughout its life as many reptiles do. This is an important detail, one that we will return to as the dinosaur story unfolds, because the question of how dinosaurs grew is central to understanding how they came to dominate the world. But for now, let us simply rest with the image of Plateosaurus in the late Triassic forests of ancient Europe, which was then very close to the equator, part of the northwestern arm of Pangaea. Imagine the animal moving slowly through a grove of cycads, its long neck swaying gently as it plucks at the fronds above, its breath warm and slow in the humid evening air. The sky above is turning deep violet, and the first stars are beginning to appear. The ornithischians, the bird-hipped dinosaurs, were also present in the Triassic, though they were far less diverse and less well known than their saurischian cousins. Early ornithischians like Pisanosaurus myrti from Argentina, and the somewhat later Lesothosaurus diagnosticus from southern Africa, were small, bipedal plant-eaters, lightly built, quick-moving, and ecologically modest in their early incarnations. What is remarkable about the early ornithischians is not what they were, but what they would become, because it is from these small, unremarkable Triassic plant-eaters that all the most visually dramatic dinosaurs of later ages would eventually emerge. The great horned ceratopsians, the armored ankylosaurs, the plated stegosaurs, the bone-headed pachycephalosaurs, and the hadrosaurs with their elaborate crests and their vast herds. All of that was still hundreds of millions of years in the future, but the seed had been planted. Throughout the late Triassic, the dinosaurs were not the dominant animals on land. That role still belonged to the etosaurs and the rauisuchians, and the various other archosaur groups that had colonized the terrestrial ecosystems of Pangaea. The dinosaurs were present, growing in diversity, exploring new ecological roles, but they were not yet ruling the world. That was about to change. At the very end of the Triassic period, approximately 200 or 1.3 million years ago, the Earth was struck by another catastrophic event. Not an asteroid this time, or at least not primarily. Instead, another massive phase of volcanic activity, the eruption of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a flood basalt event associated with the initial rifting of Pangaea as the supercontinent began its long and slow process of breaking apart. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, as this crisis is known, was not as severe as the Great Dying, but it was deeply consequential. Approximately 50 to 60% of all species on Earth were lost. The etosaurs vanished. The phytosaurs, semi-aquatic archosaurs that had occupied an ecological role similar to modern crocodilians, disappeared. Most of the rauisuchians were gone. Many of the synapsids, the distant relatives of mammals, were severely reduced. The dinosaurs survived. More than that, they emerged from the Triassic-Jurassic extinction as the dominant land vertebrates on Earth. The ecological space that had been occupied by all those vanished groups was now open, waiting, full of possibility. The dinosaurs walked into it, and over the next 130 million years, they would fill it in ways that still astonish us today. Rest with that for a moment. The end of the Triassic, the beginning of the Jurassic, the dawn of the age of dinosaurs, properly speaking. The world is different now. The continents have begun to separate, the first thin seaways appearing between what will eventually become North America and Europe, between Africa and South America. The forests are changing. The climate is shifting. And on every continent, in every forest and floodplain and coastal marsh and upland meadow, the dinosaurs are expanding, diversifying, growing. The story is accelerating now. Let yourself settle more deeply into stillness as we follow them forward. The Jurassic period began approximately 201 million years ago, and for the dinosaurs, it was a time of extraordinary promise. The extinctions at the end of the Triassic had cleared the landscape of competitors, and the dinosaurs were uniquely positioned to take advantage of the empty world. But before we rush into the great diversity of the Jurassic, let us pause and breathe into the early Jurassic for a while, that slightly overlooked opening chapter of the new era, when the dinosaurs were still finding their new footing in a world that had just been reorganized around them. The early Jurassic, roughly 201 to 175 million years ago, was a world still recovering from the Triassic-Jurassic extinction. The climate was warm, warmer than today, with no polar ice caps and a largely equable temperature gradient from equator to poles. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were high, greenhouse conditions prevailed, and the world's vegetation was lush in the low and middle latitudes while more temperate forests extended toward the poles. Pangaea was fracturing. The rifting that had begun at the very end of the Triassic was continuing, and the first true oceanic crust was being generated in what would become the Central Atlantic. The Tethys Sea, a vast, warm, shallow ocean that had separated the northern landmasses of Laurasia from the southern landmasses of Gondwana, was beginning to change shape as the continent shifted. The world was becoming more complex geographically, more varied in its environments, and this increasing geographical diversity would drive the diversification of the dinosaurs in profound ways. Among the early Jurassic theropods, one of the most significant groups was the ceratosaurs, a diverse lineage of mostly bipedal carnivores that would persist throughout the Mesozoic and produce some of the most remarkable predators of the age. In the early Jurassic, ceratosaurs were still relatively modest in size. Dilophosaurus wethereeli, from the Kayenta Formation of Arizona, was one of the largest early Jurassic theropods, growing to lengths of perhaps 6 meters, with a distinctive pair of parallel crests running along the top of its skull. Dilophosaurus is famous partly because of its appearance in popular culture, and partly because that popular portrayal is somewhat at odds with the scientific evidence. The film version of this animal spits venom and has a neck frill, neither of which is supported by the fossils. What the fossils do tell us is more interesting and more subtle. A relatively lightly built predator with powerful hind limbs and a somewhat weaker skull compared to later large theropods, suggesting that Dilophosaurus may have been a generalist predator, perhaps taking smaller prey and scavenging larger carcasses when the opportunity arose. The sauropodomorphs of the early Jurassic were undergoing a profound transition. The prosauropods, that broad group of bipedal to quadrupedal early sauropodomorphs that had been so diverse in the late Triassic, were giving way to the true sauropods, a lineage characterized by obligate quadrupedalism, enormous body size, and the beginnings of the extreme neck elongation that would become one of the most iconic features of the dinosaur world. Vulcanodon caribensis from the early Jurassic of Zimbabwe is one of the earliest confirmed sauropods. It was already quadrupedal and already substantially larger than most of its theropod contemporaries, but it was still modest compared to what was coming. Perhaps 10 meters long, relatively lightly built for a sauropod, with limbs that were just beginning to develop the columnar, pillar-like proportions that would characterize the great sauropod giants of the Middle and Late Jurassic. In the early Jurassic, the ornithischians were also diversifying, quietly and persistently, largely below the ecological radar of the larger theropods and the growing sauropods. Heterodontosaurus tuki, from the early Jurassic of South Africa, was a small but fascinating dinosaur, perhaps a meter long, with a remarkably diverse dentition, that included both small leaf-shaped grinding teeth and prominent tusk-like canines, a combination that earned it the name meaning different-toothed lizard. Heterodontosaurus and its relatives, the heterodontosaurids, are enigmatic animals even today. Their exact position within the Ornithischian family tree is still debated, and the function of their unusual teeth remains uncertain. Were the tusks used in combat? In display? In root digging? We do not know, but the mere fact of their complexity speaks to the rapid diversification of even the smallest dinosaur groups in the early Jurassic, as different lineages explored different ecological strategies in the newly opened world. Let yourself drift with these images. The early Jurassic morning, warm and misty, in a broad river valley somewhere in what will one day be North Africa, though the continent does not yet bear that name or that shape. A group of Ankylosaurus, small, slender sauropodomorphs, their long necks reaching up toward the fronds of a tree fern, moving slowly through the vegetation. A Dilophosaurus in the middle distance, half hidden by a stand of cycads, watching with large yellow eyes. The morning calls of insects and early lizards filling the humid air. It is a peaceful scene, and yet there is an energy beneath it, a sense of possibility, of expansion, of life reaching outward into every available space with the quiet persistence that is evolution's most powerful characteristic. The early Jurassic is the great setting out. The dinosaurs have inherited the world and they are beginning slowly and magnificently to make it their own. Over the next 25 million years, they would grow into forms that would take the breath away. The relationship between the dinosaurs and the plants of their world is one of the most fascinating and underexplored aspects of Mesozoic ecology, and it is worth pausing here to think about it, because the plants shaped the dinosaurs just as surely as the dinosaurs shaped the plants. The forests of the early Jurassic were dominated by gymnosperms, plants that reproduce via exposed seeds rather than the enclosed seeds of the flowering plants that would emerge much later. Conifers, cycads, ginkgos, seed ferns, and tree ferns formed the major vegetation communities of the early Mesozoic landscape. These were not the soft, nutritious plants of today's tropical forests. Conifer needles are tough, often resinous, and relatively low in nutritional value. Cycad fronds contain toxins as a defense against herbivory. Tree fern fronds are fibrous and hard to digest. Eating this vegetation required specialized dentition, specialized digestive systems, and, in the case of the great sauropods, extraordinary quantities of food to sustain enormous body masses. The evolution of the sauropods must be understood partly in the context of this difficult food source. It is no coincidence that the largest animals that ever walked on land evolved in an ecosystem dominated by tough, fibrous, low-nutrition plants. To extract enough energy from such a diet required either processing it very efficiently or processing it in such enormous volumes that efficiency was replaced by sheer throughput. The sauropods chose the second option. They were, in the most literal sense, eating machines, vast living digestive vats that consumed enormous quantities of plant material, relied on fermentation in their enormous guts to break down the tough cellulose, and grew to sizes that made them effectively immune from predation once they reached adulthood. But all of that magnificence was still developing in the early Jurassic. The great giants were still to come, for now rest with the forests of cycads and conifers, the warm Jurassic air thick with moisture and fragrance, the quiet sounds of a world in the process of becoming something extraordinary. If the early Jurassic was the age of setting out, the middle and late Jurassic, roughly 175 to 145 million years ago, was the age of becoming. This was when the dinosaurs achieved their most spectacular forms, when the giants walked the earth in numbers and varieties that still astonish the imagination, when the whole character of the Mesozoic world was defined by their presence in their ecology. Breathe deeply now, and let yourself sink into the Jurassic. The world of the Middle and Late Jurassic was different from the early Jurassic in several important ways. Pangaea had continued to break apart. The central Atlantic was now a real, if narrow, ocean, and the southern supercontinent of Gondwana was beginning its own internal fragmentation. The climate was still warm and largely equable, but there was more geographical variety now, more contrast between coastal and interior environments, more diversity in the vegetation communities. And the dinosaurs were responding to all of that variety with extraordinary creativity. The sauropods of the Middle and Late Jurassic were the largest animals ever to walk on land. Full stop. No other group of terrestrial animals before or since has produced individuals of comparable size. The great sauropods of the Late Jurassic, animals like Brachiosaurus altithorax, Diplodocus carnegie, Apatosaurus ajax, Supersaurus viviani, and the later Patagotitan majorum, were not merely large. They were large in a way that transcends easy comprehension. Patagotitan, discovered in Argentina in the early 21st century, is currently the largest dinosaur known from reasonably complete remains. Estimates of its mass range from 60 to 75 metric tons. Its femur, the thigh bone, was nearly 2.5 meters long. If you stood beside this animal, the top of your head would not reach its knee. But let us not simply cite statistics, because the numbers, however large, do not really convey what it meant to share a world with these animals. Imagine standing at the edge of a late Jurassic river, somewhere in what will one day be Wyoming. The river is broad and slow, lined with galleries of tree ferns and giant horsetails. Behind the riparian vegetation, a vast floodplain stretches away, dotted with stands of conifers, monkey puzzle trees and their relatives, and the lower, more uniform canopy of cycads and ferns. The sky is high and pale, the Jurassic sun warm on your face. And then you hear them. Not one, but a dozen, moving through the conifer forest with a sound that is more felt than heard. A deep rhythmic percussion as each foot descends, a slow shaking of the ground that you feel in your chest, in your bones, in the pit of your stomach. The trees at the forest edge begin to tremble. The water of the river shivers in concentric rings from the bank. They emerge from the forest edge one by one. Diplodocus, long-necked, long-tailed, moving with a slow, swaying grace that is entirely at odds with their scale. Their heads are small and held relatively low. Diplodocus was probably a low to medium browser, grazing on ground-level ferns and low shrubs rather than reaching into the high canopy. Their tails are extraordinarily long, nearly half their total body length, and they carry them raised above the ground, counterbalancing the weight of the neck and body. The sound of their breathing is audible now, a slow, deep rhythm. Their eyes are set on the sides of their heads, giving them a wide field of view, and several of them are watching you with a calm, ancient curiosity that holds no fear and no aggression. They are simply too large for fear to be a useful response to anything smaller than they are. A juvenile, perhaps 8 or 10 meters long, dwarfed by the adults around it, pauses to watch you more intently, its head tilted to one side in a gesture that is surprisingly, unexpectedly familiar. And then the herd moves on, past you, past the river, out onto the floodplain, and the sound of the earth shaking gradually recedes, and the birds, the early birds, the avian theropods, not yet the diverse creatures of the Cretaceous, but already present and watchful, resume their calls in the suddenly quiet trees. Breathe. That is the Jurassic. That is what it meant to live in a world of giants. The theropods of the late Jurassic were equally extraordinary, though in a different way. The apex predators of the Jurassic North American ecosystems were the allosaurids, large, powerful, bipedal carnivores built on a different plan from the tyrannosaurs that would dominate the later Cretaceous. Allosaurus fragilis was the most common large predator of the Morrison Formation, that extraordinary geological unit exposed across the American West that has yielded more large Jurassic dinosaur fossils than any other deposit on Earth. Allosaurus was 8 to 12 meters long, powerfully built, with a skull that was large but relatively lightly constructed, more of a slashing weapon than a crushing one. Its upper jaw could flex slightly relative to the lower, allowing it to open its mouth unusually wide, and it may have attacked by striking downward with its upper jaw like a hatchet, using the serrated teeth to inflict slashing wounds rather than crushing bites. Allosaurus was not alone. The Morrison Formation has also yielded Ceratosaurus nasicornis, a ceratosaur with a distinctive nasal horn and a body plan somewhat different from the allosaurids, and the giant Saurophaganax maximus, which may have been an even larger relative of Allosaurus, or perhaps Allosaurus itself at extreme size. These predators shared their world not just with the great sauropods, but with an increasingly diverse fauna of smaller and medium-sized dinosaurs. The ornithischians of the Jurassic were beginning to diversify into the great armoured and plated lineages that would characterise the later Mesozoic. Stegosaurus stenops is perhaps the most iconic Jurassic ornithischian, the classic plated dinosaur, its body arrayed with a double row of diamond-shaped dermal plates running along the spine, and 4 tail spikes, the thagomizer, as they have come to be informally known, extending horizontally from the tail's end. Stegosaurus was a large animal, up to 9 meters long, but its brain was famously small, no larger than a walnut according to some early estimates, though this comparison was somewhat exaggerated. More accurate to say that Stegosaurus had a brain proportional to its body mass, in a way that was typical for a large herbivore of its time, with no particular need for the cognitive complexity that smaller, more agile animals required. The function of the plates has been debated for over a century. Early reconstructions showed them lying flat against the body in a protective role. Later interpretations suggested that they were held erect and used primarily for thermoregulation. The plates are richly vascularized, suggesting that blood flow through them could have helped to absorb solar heat in the morning and dissipate excess heat during the heat of the day. More recent thinking incorporates a role in species recognition and display. The plates may have been brightly coloured, and their distinctive shape and arrangement may have served as a visual signal to both potential mates and potential rivals. Whatever their function, the plates make Stegosaurus one of the most unmistakable animals in the history of life on Earth. An animal with a silhouette unlike anything else that has ever walked on 4 legs, ancient and alien and somehow deeply, inexplicably beautiful. Rest with that image as your breath continues to slow. The Jurassic evening cooling now as the sun descends, the shadows of cycads and conifers lengthening across the floodplain. A Stegosaurus at the water's edge, drinking slowly, its plates lit by the orange light of sunset. The river murmuring, the distant calls of small theropods in the fern meadow, the world enormous and quiet around this single extraordinary animal. This is the Jurassic. This is the world the dinosaurs built. And it is not finished yet, not by a long way. The late Jurassic also saw the emergence of one of the most significant developments in the entire history of vertebrate life, the origin of birds. Birds are dinosaurs. Not descended from dinosaurs, not related to dinosaurs. Birds are, in the strictest taxonomic sense, dinosaurs. Avian dinosaurs. The last surviving lineage of a clade that once contained thousands of species and dominated the land environments of the Earth for over 160 million years. The evolutionary transition from non-avian theropod to bird was not a single moment, but a gradual accumulation of features over tens of millions of years. Many of the characteristics we associate with birds, feathers, wishbones, hollow bones, warm-bloodedness, certain aspects of nest-building behaviour, evolved long before the first true bird appeared. The transition was a continuum, not a crossing. But if we are looking for a single symbolic moment in that transition, a creature that crystallises the in-between, we could hardly do better than Archaeopteryx lithographica, discovered in the fine-grained Solnhofen limestone of Bavaria in 1861. Just 2 years after Darwin published his theory of evolution by natural selection, and immediately recognised as an extraordinary piece of evidence for that theory. Archaeopteryx was about the size of a raven. It had feathers, genuine asymmetric flight feathers of the kind found on modern birds, arranged along the forelimbs in a wing-like configuration. It had a wishbone, formed by the fusion of the 2 clavicles, a feature found in all birds and in many non-avian theropods. It could probably fly, or at least glide, though the extent of its aerial ability is still debated. But Archaeopteryx also had teeth, real teeth, set in true alveoli in the jaw, unlike any modern bird. It had a long, bony tail, quite unlike the short, muscular tail of modern birds. Its wings had 3 distinct clawed fingers, visible in the best specimens. By most measures, Archaeopteryx was more dinosaur than bird, a creature poised exquisitely on the boundary between 2 worlds, neither one thing nor the other, a living embodiment of the gradual, cumulative, beautiful process of evolution. The discovery of Archaeopteryx in the Jurassic rocks of Bavaria was in many ways the moment when the dinosaurs became something more than monsters. It was the moment when they became our relatives. Because if birds are dinosaurs and birds are alive today, then we live in a world that still contains living dinosaurs. The dinosaurs did not simply disappear 66 million years ago. One lineage survived, diversified, and filled the skies of every continent with song. The next time you hear a bird singing in the morning, remember, that song is Jurassic. That song is 150 million years old, or the distant echo of one. The feathered creature on the branch outside your window carries in its bones and in its blood the faint, deep memory of a world of giants, of warm Jurassic mornings, of forests that no longer exist under a sky that has never been mapped. Let that thought carry you gently towards stillness. You are not separate from that ancient world. You are its inheritor, and in the sound of birdsong at dawn, that world is still speaking. The transition from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous period, approximately 145 million years ago, was not marked by a major extinction event. It was a gradual passage, the world shifting incrementally from one configuration to another, the dinosaurs continuing their long reign without interruption. But the world of the Cretaceous was different from the world of the Jurassic in ways that would profoundly shape the evolution of the dinosaurs during their final and most diverse chapter. The most important change was botanical. Sometime in the early Cretaceous, perhaps around 130 to 125 million years ago, the flowering plants, the angiosperms, appeared and began their extraordinary radiation across the Earth. The angiosperms were and remain the most successful group of plants in the history of land vegetation. Their flowers attracted insect pollinators, creating the co-evolutionary relationship between flower and pollinator that has shaped the ecology of land environments ever since. Their enclosed seeds, protected within fruit, attracted animal dispersers, creating another great co-evolutionary web. Their leaves were often softer, more nutritious, and more digestible than the tough foliage of the gymnosperms that had dominated the earlier Mesozoic. The rise of the angiosperms transformed the world. By the late Cretaceous, around 75 to 66 million years ago, flowering plants dominated most of the world's vegetation communities. Broad-leaved forests, meadows of ground cover and flowering shrubs had replaced or supplemented the gymnosperm-dominated landscapes of the earlier Mesozoic. The visual character of the world had changed. It was a greener world, a more colourful world, a world that in its basic outlines would have felt more familiar to modern eyes. And the dinosaurs responded to this transformed world with a final magnificent burst of evolutionary creativity. The early Cretaceous, before the angiosperms fully took hold, was already a world of remarkable dinosaurian diversity. The continents were now substantially separated, Laurasia in the north, Gondwana in the south, with various intermediate landmasses in between. This geographical separation was driving the evolution of distinct dinosaur faunas on different continents, each adapting to its own local environments and ecology. In the early Cretaceous of China, the extraordinary fossil beds of Liaoning province were preserving, in exquisite detail, a window into the world of feathered dinosaurs that had no parallel anywhere else on Earth. The Yixian Formation and the related Jiufatang Formation, dating to approximately 130 to 120 million years ago, have yielded hundreds of feathered dinosaur specimens, animals of all sizes and ecological roles, most of them preserved with evidence of feathers, from simple filamentous proto-feathers to fully modern-looking pennaceous flight feathers. Microraptor Guy, one of the most extraordinary animals in the history of paleontology, had 4 wings, not 2. Its hind limbs bore long flight feathers arranged in a wing-like configuration, suggesting that it may have been capable of aerial locomotion using all 4 limbs. Whether it flew in the manner of a biplane or glided from trees, or used some combination of techniques is still debated. But the mere fact of its existence, a 4-winged dinosaur preserved in stone with every feather visible, is a reminder of how strange and how wonderful the real history of life actually is. Sinornithosaurus milleni, Confuciusornis sanctus, Psittacosaurus mongoliensis, Yuanchuavis compsosura. The names accumulate like a litany, each one a doorway into a world of extraordinary evolutionary experimentation. The early Cretaceous of China was, in the most literal sense, the world of birds becoming themselves, working out the details of flight and feathers and beak shape in a rich ecological context that has been preserved for us with miraculous precision. Let yourself drift with the image of these animals, small, feathered, quick. Moving through the branches of early Cretaceous conifers, foraging for insects and seeds, sometimes launching themselves into short gliding or flapping flights between trees. The forest around them is thick and damp, the light filtering through layers of foliage. Somewhere nearby, larger dinosaurs moved through the undergrowth, early ceratopsians, small ornithopods, the occasional glimpse of a large theropod moving with deliberate slowness along a dried stream bed. The early Cretaceous world is not quiet. It is full of the sounds of life in all its variety. In the western interior of what will one day become North America, the Cretaceous seas were rising. The Western Interior Seaway, a vast shallow epicontinental sea that divided North America in two for much of the late Cretaceous, was beginning to form, splitting the continent into two large land masses and creating the ecological isolation that would drive the divergent evolution of dinosaur faunas in the east and west. In South America, the sauropods were still flourishing, producing the great titanosaur lineage that would give rise to the very largest dinosaurs, animals like Argentinosaurus huinculensis, from the late Cretaceous of Argentina, which may have weighed close to 80 or 90 metric tons, dwarfing even the Great Morrison Formation giants of the Jurassic. In Africa, in what is now Egypt and Morocco, the abelisaurid ceratosaurs were evolving into the apex predators of the southern land masses. Animals like Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, that extraordinary theropod with its tall neural spines forming a dramatic sail-like crest along its back. An animal now understood to have been not a terrestrial predator in the traditional sense, but a semi-aquatic fish-eater, wading through the rivers of North Africa in search of the enormous lungfish and coelacanths that inhabited those ancient waters. Spinosaurus is one of the most fascinating and controversial animals in all of paleontology. When it was first described in 1915 from specimens collected in Egypt, it was recognized as a large theropod, very large, possibly larger than Tyrannosaurus, but its unusual body plan was not well understood. Then the original specimens were destroyed in World War II in a bombing raid on the Munich Museum. For decades, Spinosaurus was known only from casts and drawings. New discoveries in Morocco in the early 21st century have revealed a creature even stranger than anyone had imagined. Spinosaurus had relatively short hind limbs and relatively long forelimbs, a body plan quite unlike most theropods. Its feet may have had webbing between the toes. Its nostrils were set back on its skull, away from the tip of the long, narrow crocodile-like snout, an arrangement that makes sense for an animal that spent time with its head partially submerged. Its neural spines were tall and thin, extending nearly 2 meters above the vertebrae in some individuals, forming a structure that may have functioned as a sail for thermoregulation, as a display structure, or as a fatty hump for energy storage. Spinosaurus is a reminder that evolution does not follow a script. It does not produce the animals that a logical analysis of ecological roles would predict. It produces the animals that happen to work, the accidents that turned out to be successes, the experiments that came through, and some of those experiments are more astonishing than anything we could have imagined in advance. Rest with Spinosaurus now. Imagine it at the edge of a North African river 105 million years ago. The river is enormous, wider than the Mississippi, fed by rains that fall on mountains no longer visible on any map. The water is brown and slow and teeming with enormous fish. The riverbanks are lined with tall conifers and the first tentative appearances of early flowering plants. The air is hot and thick with humidity. And Spinosaurus wades in slowly, its enormous body moving with surprising grace, the tall sail of its back bright in the midday sun. It plunges its long snout into the water, and when it lifts its head, a great flailing lungfish is clamped in those narrow conical teeth, and the river ripples where the dinosaur stood. It is not terrifying, it is magnificent. It is life in one of its most creative expressions. Let that image carry you forward into the late Cretaceous, where the dinosaurs will produce their final and perhaps most diverse flowering, where the great horned giants and the armoured walking fortresses and the crested, social, complex plant-eaters of the northern continents will reach their full expression just in time for the end of everything they have built. We left the early Triassic recovering from the Great Dying, and we spoke of the archosaurs beginning their long ascent. But let us go deeper into that world, because the archosaurs who would eventually give rise to the dinosaurs were themselves part of a complex and extraordinary ecosystem, and understanding that ecosystem helps us understand why the dinosaurs eventually succeeded in such spectacular fashion. The archosaurs, a name derived from the Greek for ruling lizards, were one of the dominant groups of land vertebrates in the Triassic, and their diversity in that period was remarkable. They had already split into two main lineages: the Pseudosuchians, which include the ancestors of modern crocodilians and a host of extinct Triassic forms, and the Avemetatarsalia, the line that would eventually give rise to pterosaurs and dinosaurs. The Pseudosuchians were, for much of the Triassic, the more successful of the two groups. They occupied apex predator niches, herbivore niches, insectivore niches, and semi-aquatic niches. The Rauisuchians, among the largest terrestrial predators of their time, were impressive animals, some reaching lengths of 8 to 10 meters, with powerful, laterally compressed skulls armed with recurved, serrated teeth. They walked with an erect or semi-erect posture, like dinosaurs, and they were formidable ecological competitors. The Etosaurs were another remarkable Pseudosuchian group, armoured, pig-snouted, medium-sized herbivores that used their broad, upturned snouts to root for tubers and other underground plant material. Their armour consisted of rows of interlocking osteoderms covering the back and flanks, and in some species the flanks bore sharp, lateral spines that would have made them unpleasant to attack. Etosaurs were widespread and sometimes abundant in mid to late Triassic continental deposits, suggesting that they were genuinely successful animals in their ecological roles. On the Avemetatarsalia side of the Archosaur divide, the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, were among the first truly successful vertebrate flyers, appearing in the late Triassic and diversifying rapidly. The early pterosaurs were small, insectivorous animals, but their capacity for powered flight immediately opened up an ecological niche, unavailable to any other vertebrate. From these small beginnings, the pterosaurs would go on to produce some of the most extraordinary flying animals in the history of life, including, in the late Cretaceous, Quetzalcoatlus northropii, with a wingspan of 10 to 11 meters, the largest flying animal ever known. But what of the first true dinosaurs in the context of this diverse Archosaur world? The earliest dinosaurs, those small, erect-postured, efficient-moving archosaurs from the late Triassic of South America, were not immediately dominant. They coexisted with the Pseudosuchians, the pterosaurs, and many other groups, and for several million years they were simply part of a complex ecological community rather than its masters. The key to understanding the eventual success of the dinosaurs lies, many researchers believe, not in a single anatomical or physiological advantage, but in a combination of factors that gave them a slight but consistent edge in the turbulent environmental conditions of the late Triassic and the Triassic-Jurassic transition. Their erect posture and more efficient locomotion meant that they expended less energy during sustained movement, an advantage in conditions where food and water might be sparsely distributed and long-distance travel necessary. Their elevated metabolic rate, or at least a metabolic rate elevated above the strictly cold-blooded condition, meant that they could sustain activity under a wider range of temperature conditions. Their relatively rapid growth, suggested by bone histology, meant that they moved quickly through the vulnerable juvenile phase into the relatively safer adult phase. None of these advantages was by itself decisive. Taken together, however, they gave the dinosaurs a consistent edge in survival and reproduction that compounded over generations and ultimately allowed them to outlast their competitors when the Triassic-Jurassic extinction arrived and the ecological playing field was reset. This is how evolution works, more often than not through dramatic single advances, but through the accumulation of small advantages that become decisive only when the environment changes in ways that make those advantages matter. Let yourself breathe with that understanding, the long patience of evolution, the small advantages compounding over millions of years into something world-changing. The way that the future belongs not to the most powerful or the most spectacular, but to the most persistently well-suited. The dinosaurs were persistently well-suited, and the world rewarded them for it. As the dinosaurs spread through the late Triassic and into the early Jurassic, they were building something entirely new, the first genuinely dinosaurian ecosystems. And these ecosystems were complex from the very beginning, with multiple trophic levels, diverse guilds of herbivores and predators, and the beginnings of the ecological relationships that would define the Mesozoic world for the next 160 million years. The earliest dinosaurian food webs were established in the late Triassic of South America and North America, and the Esquigolasto Formation of Argentina, the rock unit that has yielded so many of the earliest dinosaur species, gives us our best window into these original ecosystems. At the base of the Ischigualasta food web were the plants: tree ferns, horsetails, seed ferns, early conifers, and various other gymnosperms that had colonized the recovering Triassic landscape. These plants supported a community of herbivores that was still dominated by non-dinosaurian archosaurs and synapsids in the earliest phases. The rhynchosaurs, a group of beaked herbivorous archosauromorphs, were particularly abundant, grazing on the low-growing vegetation with their powerful shearing dentition. The etosaurs, as we have noted, were also important herbivores. The dinosaurian herbivores of the late Triassic were initially secondary in importance. The early sauropodomorphs, animals like Chromogesaurus novesi from the Ischigualasto Formation, were probably generalist omnivores or opportunistic plant eaters, not yet the dedicated bulk-feeding specialists of later Jurassic times. They browsed selectively on the more nutritious parts of plants, perhaps supplementing their diet with insects, small vertebrates, and whatever protein sources were available. The predators of the late Triassic Ischigualasto ecosystem were similarly mixed. The dinosaurian predators, Eoraptor, Eodromeus, and Herrerasaurus, coexisted with large pseudosuchian predators and various other archosaur carnivores. Herrerasaurus, as the largest dinosaurian predator in the ecosystem at 4 to 5 meters long, probably occupied a high trophic position, but even it was not the unequivocal apex predator, competing with larger Auasuchians for the biggest prey. This early complexity is important because it shows us that the dinosaurian ecosystems did not arise fully formed. They were assembled gradually, piece by piece, as different lineages diversified, and as the ecological relationships between them were worked out through millions of generations of predator-prey interactions, competitive exclusion, and coevolutionary dynamics. The transition to fully dinosaur-dominated ecosystems came with the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, as we have discussed. In the aftermath of that extinction, the dinosaurs found themselves in a world where their main competitors had been eliminated, and they rapidly radiated into the available ecological space. What is remarkable about this radiation is how quickly it produced ecological complexity. Within a few million years of the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, the early Jurassic dinosaurian ecosystems of North America, preserved in the Kayenta and Monet formations of Arizona and Utah, already showed a multi-layered structure, with small insectivorous and omnivorous theropods at the base of the carnivore guild, medium-sized predators in the middle tiers, and large sauropodomorphs and large theropods at the top. The herbivore community was similarly layered, with different species feeding at different heights and on different plant material. This rapid ecological diversification speaks to the extraordinary evolutionary flexibility of the dinosaur body plan. The basic dinosaurian blueprint, bipedal or quadrupedal, with an erect posture, efficient locomotion, and elevated metabolic rate, was extraordinarily generative. It could be modified to produce animals as different as the tiny feathered, insect-catching Microraptorians and the 100-ton Titanosaur sauropods. It could support herbivores and carnivores, fast runners and slow walkers, arboreal climbers and semi-aquatic waders. No other vertebrate group has demonstrated such ecological versatility, and it is that versatility, more than any single adaptation, that explains the long dominance of the dinosaurs. Breathe gently with that thought. The world of the early Jurassic, complex and varied, the dinosaurs already filling it with their extraordinary diversity. The food webs of the ancient world, stretching from the smallest insect to the largest sauropod, all connected in a web of dependency and interaction that sustained itself for millions of years. The web is broken now, but its ghost is still present in the structure of the world we inhabit. We have spoken of the sauropods in the context of the Jurassic, and we have cited some of the statistics of their size. But the sauropods deserve a more extended, more contemplative treatment, because they are perhaps the most extraordinary animals in the entire history of life on land, and their story is one that rewards slow, careful attention. Let your breathing be slow and regular as we spend some extended time with the sauropods. The sauropod body plan is at first glance paradoxical. Enormous body mass, greater than that of any other terrestrial animal before or since, a neck that in some species extended to lengths of 15 meters or more, the longest neck of any animal ever known, a tail of comparable length acting as counterbalance, 4 columnar legs, each bearing a weight equivalent to multiple adult elephants, a head that is, in proportion to the rest of the body, tiny, barely the size of a horse's head on a body the size of a barn. How did this body plan work? How did these animals maintain themselves? The answer, as we have touched on, lies in a suite of physiological and anatomical adaptations that work together to make the seemingly impossible possible. The most important of these was the respiratory system. Like modern birds, the sauropods almost certainly had a system of interconnected air sacs that extended through much of the body, not just the lungs, but filling the cavities of the vertebrae and the spaces between organs. This air sac system served multiple purposes. It significantly reduced the weight of the skeleton, which in the largest sauropods was already largely hollow. The vertebrae of Argentinosaurus and other giant titanosaurs contain enormous pluricoils, air-filled cavities that could constitute more than half the volume of the bone. It allowed a continuous flow of air through the lungs, fresh air entering on the inhalation and the previous breath being pushed through on the exhalation, a more efficient system than the tidal breathing of mammals, in which the lungs are never completely refreshed of stale air. The sauropod neck was supported not by massive weight-bearing muscles pulling from below, as in the neck of a giraffe or a horse, but by a system of ligaments running above the vertebrae, like a suspension bridge cable. The neural spines of the neck and back vertebrae were elongated in many sauropods, providing anchor points for these ligaments, and the system allowed the neck to be held out and up with relatively little muscular effort, an elegant engineering solution to the problem of supporting a structure of extreme length and weight. The feet of the sauropods bore an unusual feature, a large pad-like cushion of cartilage and connective tissue on the underside of the foot, behind the toes, similar to the structure seen in modern elephants. This pad would have absorbed the enormous impact forces generated with each step, distributing the load across a wider area and protecting the bones of the foot and leg from the kind of stress fractures that would otherwise have been inevitable. The growth rates of sauropods were extraordinary. Bone histology studies, reading the growth rings in thin sections of sauropod bone, suggest that the largest sauropods grew at rates comparable to, or even exceeding those of the fastest-growing large mammals. A patagotitan may have reached close to adult size within 30 to 40 years, growing at rates of several tons per year during its most rapid growth phase. This is not slow growth. This is phenomenally fast growth, achieved through a combination of high metabolic rate and extraordinary food intake. And the food intake was indeed extraordinary. Estimates for the daily caloric needs of a fully grown adult patagotitan range up to 100,000 kilocalories per day, roughly 50 times the caloric requirement of an adult human and several times that of a modern elephant. To meet this need, the sauropods were consuming plant material essentially continuously during daylight hours, their small heads and simple peg-like teeth gathering vegetation quickly and swallowing it unchewed, relying entirely on their enormous digestive tracts, possibly assisted by a gizzard containing stones, to break it down. The images that emerge from all of this physiological detail are striking. Imagine a herd of adult patagotitan moving through a late Cretaceous conifer forest in what is now Patagonia. The trees around them are large by any normal standard. Conifers 30 or 40 meters tall, their trunks a meter or more in diameter, but the sauropods are simply larger. Their heads, reaching up into the canopy, are stripping branches 15 or 20 meters above the forest floor. Their footsteps leave impressions in the soft ground that a human could stand in chest deep. The sound of their digestive processes, the deep, resonant rumbling of their fermentation chambers, is audible from tens of meters away. And yet, for all their staggering size, they are not terrifying. They are magnificent. They are the expression of a single evolutionary strategy carried to its logical extreme. The strategy of being so large that nothing can harm you, of processing such enormous quantities of low-quality food that the poor nutritional value of Mesozoic vegetation becomes irrelevant through sheer volume. It worked. It worked for over 150 million years, across every continent on Earth. The sauropod body plan was one of the most successful in the entire history of vertebrate life, and the fact that it ended with the Chicxulub impact, rather than through any ecological failure of its own, is a measure not of its inadequacy, but of the sheer scale of that catastrophe. Rest with the sauropods now, in their quiet magnificence. The ancient forests around them dappled with light, the ground trembling gently with their passage, the world enormous and slow, and full of a kind of deep, vegetative peace. This is the Mesozoic at its most serene. This is what the word ancient really means. Breathe. No account of the Mesozoic world would be complete without a visit to the pterosaurs, those extraordinary flying archosaurs who shared the skies with the early birds and dominated aerial ecosystems for the entire duration of the Mesozoic era. The pterosaurs were not dinosaurs. They were the sister group of the dinosaurs, sharing a common ancestor with them in the early Triassic, but diverging onto a separate evolutionary path. But they were close relatives, and their story is deeply intertwined with that of the dinosaurs, and the skies they filled were part of the same world. The earliest pterosaurs appeared in the late Triassic, roughly 220 million years ago, and from their first appearance, they were already fully capable flyers. The origin of pterosaur flight is one of the most debated questions in paleontology, partly because the transition is so poorly documented in the fossil record. We have no clear proto-pterosaur, no gradual series of forms showing the step-by-step development of the pterosaur wing from a non-flying ancestor. The pterosaurs appear in the fossil record already flying, already specialized with no clear intermediate forms. The pterosaur wing was structured differently from the wings of birds and bats. In birds, the wing is formed primarily by the second and third digits of the forelimb, with the wing feathers attached to the arm and hand. In bats, the wing membrane extends between the very long fingers of the hand and the body. In pterosaurs, the wing was formed by a single enormously elongated fourth finger, with a membrane of skin, the patagium, stretching from the tip of this finger back to the hind limb. This single finger wing is unique among vertebrates, and it was extraordinarily effective. Pterosaurs ranged in wingspan from the tiny Nemicalopterus crypticus, with a wingspan of perhaps 25 centimeters, smaller than many modern sparrows, to the enormous Quetzalcoatlus northropi and Hatzegopteryx tambima of the late Cretaceous, with wingspans of 10 to 11 meters. Quetzalcoatlus, when standing on the ground, was as tall as a modern giraffe. It was the largest flying animal in the history of life. How an animal of that size could fly at all is a question that has fascinated and perplexed researchers for decades. The answer seems to lie in a combination of a relatively light body. The bones of pterosaurs were hollow to an extreme degree, with walls sometimes only a millimeter thick, and a launching mechanism that used all four limbs simultaneously, the animal essentially pole vaulting off the ground to achieve the altitude and speed needed for takeoff. The pterosaurs of the late Jurassic and Cretaceous were extraordinarily diverse in their ecological roles. Some, like the pteranodontids of the Cretaceous Western Interior Seaway, were long-winged, toothless, fish-eating aerial specialists, soaring over the inland sea on wings spanning 6 to 9 meters, plunging their long, pelican-like pouched beaks into the water to snatch fish. Others, like the tapirjarids, had elaborate cranial crests that may have been used in display and were probably fruit-eaters or generalist feeders in forest environments. The Disungoripterids had peculiar up-curved, toothless beak tips with crushing teeth farther back in the jaw, suggesting a diet of hard-shelled invertebrates pried from rocks. The pterosaurs were also, like the dinosaurs, warm-blooded, or at least elevated in their metabolic rate above the cold-blooded baseline. This is indicated by their bone histology, by the presence of a fibre covering, pycnofibers, on their bodies that functioned like fur for insulation, and by the energetic demands of powered flight, which cannot be sustained by a cold-blooded animal. The relationship between the pterosaurs and the birds in the Cretaceous skies is an interesting one. For much of the early and middle Cretaceous, pterosaurs and birds coexisted in the sky, without obvious competitive exclusion. They occupied different size ranges and different ecological niches. The birds dominated the small, fast maneuverable end of the spectrum. The large pterosaurs dominated the soaring and gliding end. Both groups found sufficient ecological space to thrive. But as the Cretaceous progressed, the diversity of large pterosaurs seems to have declined while the diversity of birds increased, particularly in the small and medium size ranges that had once been occupied by a wider variety of pterosaur species. Whether this represents competitive exclusion of pterosaurs by birds, or simply reflects the different preservational biases of the fossil record, or is an artifact of the geographic distribution of the best-studied fossil deposits, remains debated. What is clear is that the pterosaurs, like the non-avian dinosaurs, did not survive the Chicxulub impact. They vanished from the fossil record at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, along with the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the ammonites, and most of the great Mesozoic dynasties. Only the birds flew on. Let yourself drift for a moment with the image of the late Cretaceous sky, a Quetzalcoatlus banking on thermals over the shallow western interior seaway, its enormous shadow passing over the dark water below. A flock of early birds, small, quick, maneuverable, scattering from the branches of a flowering tree at the shoreline, the sky enormous and blue above them both, indifferent to the fact that one of these lineages will survive and one will not. The sky is still enormous, the birds are still there, and in some sense the sky still holds the ghost of those vast wings. The dinosaurs walked the land, the pterosaurs ruled the sky, and in the seas of the Mesozoic, a different caste of extraordinary animals held dominion over the oceans, and they too were shaped by the long history of the era, and their story deserves telling in this quiet space between wakefulness and sleep. The Mesozoic seas were, in many ways, more alien than the Mesozoic land. They were ruled not by dinosaurs, which were strictly terrestrial, but by a series of lineages that had secondarily returned to the water from land-dwelling ancestors, just as whales and dolphins would do in the Eocene. The first great marine reptiles of the Mesozoic were the ichthyosaurs, dolphin-shaped animals that appeared in the early Triassic, shortly after the Great Dying, and reached their peak diversity and abundance in the Jurassic. The ichthyosaurs were so thoroughly adapted to marine life that their bodies had converged through evolution on the same basic shape as modern dolphins: a spindle-shaped body, a dorsal fin, a crescent-shaped tail fin, and flippers derived from the bones of their terrestrial ancestors' limbs. They breathed air like all reptiles, but they spent their entire lives in the sea, giving birth to live young in the water. Temnodontosaurus plateodon, from the early Jurassic of Europe, had eyes with a diameter of up to 25 centimetres, the largest eyes, relative to skull size, of almost any vertebrate ever known. These extraordinary eyes were probably adaptations for hunting in deep or murky water, where light penetration is limited. The sheer size of the eye would have allowed it to gather even the faintest traces of bioluminescent light from deep-sea prey, or to detect the silhouettes of fish against the faint illumination of the surface water far above. Shonisaurus sicaniensis, from the late Triassic of British Columbia, was a giant among ichthyosaurs. At 21 metres in length, it was comparable in size to a modern sperm whale, and represents one of the largest animals known from the Triassic period. It may have been a deep diver, using its enormous size to reach depths at which large cephalopods, ammonites and early squids and nautiluses could be caught. The plesiosaurs were the other great lineage of Mesozoic marine reptiles, and they came in two quite different body plans. The long-necked plesiosaurs, the plesiosauroids, had small heads, extremely long necks, and relatively compact bodies, hunting fish and soft-bodied prey in the upper water column. The short-necked plesiosaurs, the pliosauroids, had enormous heads, powerful jaws, and short necks, and they were the apex predators of the Jurassic and early Cretaceous seas. Plesiosaurus funki, from the late Jurassic of Norway, was one of the largest of the plesiosaurs. With a skull estimated at nearly 3 metres in length and a total body length of perhaps 12 to 15 metres, it had one of the most powerful bites of any animal ever known, estimated at several times that of a modern saltwater crocodile. It was the T-Rex of the Jurassic Ocean, an apex predator of such size and power that nothing in its environment posed a serious threat to it. The mosasaurs arrived later in the story, appearing in the late Cretaceous as the ichthyosaurs were declining and rapidly diversifying to fill the ecological space. Mosasaurs were related to modern monitor lizards, and their transformation from terrestrial ancestors to fully aquatic apex predators was rapid by geological standards. Within a few million years of their first appearance, they had evolved into animals ranging from small eel-like fish hunters to the enormous Mosasaurus hoffmanni, at 17 metres one of the largest predators of the Cretaceous seas. The Mesozoic oceans were also home to the ammonites, one of the most successful and diverse groups in the entire history of marine invertebrates. Ammonites were cephalopods, relatives of modern squids, octopuses, and nautiluses, distinguished by their coiled shells, which range from tight planispiral coils to loose, helical spirals, to uncoiled straight or curved forms in the heteromorph ammonites of the Cretaceous. They appeared in the Devonian and survived through the Great Dying, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, and several smaller extinction events, only to vanish completely at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. The ammonites were so abundant and their shells evolved so rapidly that individual species had very short stratigraphic ranges, making them extraordinarily useful as index fossils for correlating rock units from different parts of the world. A geologist finding a particular ammonite species in a rock can place that rock in a specific time interval with remarkable precision, often to within a few 100,000 years. The diversity of ammonite shell shapes, from the tight coils of Jurassic ammonites to the extraordinary baroque elaborations of late Cretaceous heteromorphs like nipponites, mirabilis, whose shell forms a three-dimensional, seemingly chaotic knot, reflects the wide variety of ecological strategies this group explored. Some were fast-moving, active hunters, others were slow-moving, bottom-dwelling scavengers. Some may have drifted in the open ocean, feeding on plankton. The diversity of shapes reflects a diversity of lives. When you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can see them. The ancient sea, warm and shallow, the light filtering down through blue-green water, ammonites drifting on gentle currents, their shells reflecting the light in iridescent spirals. A plesiosaur moving through the middle distance, its four flippers rowing it forward in smooth, powerful strokes. A school of large fish scattering as something enormous rises from below. The Mesozoic ocean, vast, warm, alive with forms that no longer exist, gone, along with everything else, 66 million years ago, but preserved in the rocks that line the coasts and ridges of the world, waiting for the patient work of erosion to expose them again, waiting for the curious human hand to brush away the matrix and reveal a spiral, or a fin bone, or the dark curve of a pliosaur's tooth. The ancient sea still speaks, in the language of stone, and if you listen quietly enough in the deep space between sleeping and waking, perhaps you can hear it. Let us linger a while longer in the world of the living dinosaurs, because there is more to explore in the texture of their daily experience. We have spoken of their physiology and their ecology, but what was it actually like to be a dinosaur? What did their world feel like from the inside? This is a question that paleontology can only partially answer. The inner experience of any animal, living or extinct, is beyond the reach of science in its fullest sense. But we can say something meaningful about the sensory world the dinosaurs inhabited, and what we can say is extraordinary. Colour was almost certainly part of the dinosaurian world in a way that would have been visually richer than our own experience. Modern birds, as we have noted, are tetrachromats, meaning they have 4 types of cone cells in their retinas, rather than the 3 that humans have. The 4th type is sensitive to ultraviolet light, a range of the electromagnetic spectrum invisible to human eyes. This ultraviolet sensitivity profoundly affects how birds perceive the world around them. Many bird feathers that appear uniformly coloured to human eyes are actually strikingly patterned in UV, visible only to other birds and to the UV-sensitive eyes of potential predators. There is good reason to think that many non-avian theropod dinosaurs shared this tetrachromatic vision, since it is the ancestral condition for archosaurs and was almost certainly present in the common ancestor of birds and their non-avian relatives. If this is correct, the world of the dinosaurs was visually richer than our own. The crests and frills and elaborate skin structures that we see preserved in fossils may have been patterned with UV reflective pigments invisible to our eyes, serving as signals in a chromatic dimension we simply cannot access. This has profound implications for our attempts to reconstruct dinosaur appearance. The extraordinary recent work on melanosomes, the microscopic pigment-containing organelles preserved in some exceptionally well-preserved feathered dinosaur fossils, has allowed researchers to begin inferring the actual colours of some feathered dinosaurs. Anchiornis huxleyi, a small feathered theropod from the early Cretaceous of China, has been reconstructed with a reddish-brown body, a rusty red crest and white and black patterning on the wing feathers, a colour scheme not unlike that of some modern woodpeckers. Microraptor gyi may have had iridescent black feathers, like a modern raven or crow. These colours. Sound was another dimension of the dinosaurian world that recent research is beginning to illuminate. The resonating chambers of hadrosaur crests we have discussed, but there is growing evidence for sound production in other dinosaur groups as well. The arrangement of the inner ear, specifically the lagina, the hearing organ, in non-avian dinosaurs can be reconstructed from CT scans of well-preserved skulls, and these reconstructions suggest that many dinosaurs were sensitive to a range of frequencies broadly similar to those detected by modern birds and crocodilians. They could not hear the very high frequencies detected by some mammals, but they were well equipped to detect low and mid-frequency sounds, the frequency range of most environmental sounds, including the calls of other large animals, the movement of vegetation, the sounds of water. Crocodilians, the living relatives of dinosaurs on the Pseudotsuchian lineage, are far more vocal than their reputation as silent predators might suggest. Modern crocodilians produce a variety of vocalizations, including bellowing during mating season, hissing in threat displays, and the extraordinary maternal calls of hatchlings, which trigger nest-opening behavior in females. If crocodilians are this vocal, there's every reason to think that dinosaurs were at least as vocal, if not more so. The elaborate cranial crests of hadrosaurs and the neck frills and horns of various ceratopsians were almost certainly involved in visual communication, as well as, in the case of the hadrosaur crests, acoustic communication. Colour patterns on the skin, postures, movements, and the displays of elaborate structures on the head and body would have all contributed to a rich visual language among conspecifics. Touch was another sense that was probably more important to dinosaurs than we typically imagine. The skin of many well-preserved dinosaur specimens shows an uneven texture, scales of different sizes and shapes arranged in patterns across the body surface. In some areas, the skin texture changes dramatically over short distances, suggesting regions of different function. Some of these regions may have been particularly touch-sensitive, like the faces of crocodilians, which are covered with small dome-shaped integumentary sense organs that detect pressure waves in water and on the skin surface. And then, the smell of the Mesozoic world would have been extraordinary to a modern human nose. The resins of conifer forests, the volatile compounds released by flowering plants in the late Cretaceous, the organic richness of vast herds of large animals, the specific scent signatures of individual animals and species that would have been as legible to a dinosaur's nose as a name tag is to a human reader. The world that the dinosaurs moved through was not just visible and audible, it was deeply, complexly fragrant, and they were exquisitely equipped to read it. All of this suggests a richness and complexity of lived experience in the dinosaurs that was once entirely unsuspected, and that even now is only partially appreciated in popular accounts of these animals. The dinosaurs were not simple, automatic machines responding to simple stimuli. They were sensory creatures, engaging with a richly textured world through sophisticated perceptual systems, communicating with one another in multiple sensory channels, and responding to their environment with behavioral flexibility and, in some cases, genuine learning. They were alive in the fullest sense of the word. Let that sink into you gently as you rest. The fullness of their aliveness, the extraordinary sensory richness of their world, the fact that 66 million years ago, on the plains and in the forests of the late Cretaceous, creatures no less vivid and no less present than you are in this moment were living their extraordinary lives. They are gone. You are here, and the world they made is the world you rest in tonight. Let us spend some time there now in those last days, before we reach the ending we already know. The Hell Creek Formation of the American West, exposed across portions of Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming, is one of the most intensively studied geological units in the world, partly because of its dinosaur fossils, but also because it spans the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, and therefore preserves a record of the world both immediately before and immediately after the impact. The Hell Creek ecosystem, in its final millions of years, was extraordinarily rich. The dominant large herbivores were the hadrosaurs and the ceratopsians, Edmontosaurus annectens and Triceratops horridus most abundantly, with ankylosaurids like Ankylosaurus magniventris and the pachycephalosaurs like Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis playing secondary roles. These animals moved through a landscape of seasonal floodplains, river systems, and mixed forests of angiosperms and conifers in a climate that was warm but somewhat cooler than the peak Cretaceous warmth of earlier periods. The predator guild was dominated by Tyrannosaurus rex, which we have already spent considerable time with, but also included smaller theropods. Trodon formosus, a relatively large-brained, highly maneuverable predator, and the dromaeosaurids like Dakotaraptor staini, large raptors with their characteristic sickle-shaped killing claws. These smaller predators occupied different ecological niches from Tyrannosaurus, hunting different prey by different methods and in different microhabitats. Life in the Hell Creek was seasonal. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the region experienced wet and dry seasons, and the large herbivore herds may have migrated seasonally in response to the availability of food and water, much as modern wildebeest and caribou do. The river systems of the Hell Creek flooded seasonally, depositing the fine sediments that would eventually preserve so many of the animals and plants that lived in and near them. The mammals of the Hell Creek were small and diverse. Over 20 species are known, ranging from insectivores to omnivores, most of them no larger than a modern rat or small rabbit. They occupied the ecological spaces that were unavailable to the larger dinosaurs: the underground burrows, the high tree canopies, the nocturnal hours when the temperature dropped, and the large reptilian predators were less active. They were present, persistent, and largely invisible in the ecological sense. Small players in a world dominated by something very different from what they would eventually become. The birds of the Hell Creek were already a diverse group. Several lineages of modern bird orders, or close relatives, were already present, including early relatives of the Anseriformes, the group that includes ducks and geese, and the Galliformes, chickens and their relatives. These birds were mostly small, mostly ground-dwelling or water-associated, and they were living the small, careful lives of animals that know themselves to be prey as much as predator. None of them, the Tyrannosaurus, the Triceratops, the small mammals, the early birds, knew what was coming. The asteroid that would end their world was in the final moments invisible in the daytime sky, a small bright point of light growing imperceptibly over the weeks and days before impact. Even on the last day, even in the hours before the impact, the Hell Creek morning would have been ordinary in all its details. The hadrosaurs wading to drink, the Tyrannosaurus on its rounds, the small mammals retreating to their burrows as the sun warmed the air. The ordinariness of those last moments is perhaps the most affecting thing about them. Not that the world ended in drama and spectacle, though it did, eventually. But that it ended in the middle of an ordinary morning, without warning, without preparation, without any possibility of last acts or final thoughts. This is what deep time does to our concepts of meaning and purpose. On the timescale of the Earth, even 160 million years is a beginning. Even the most successful and enduring lineage can be ended by an event that takes perhaps 30 seconds from first impact to the beginning of the fire. But the meaning is not in the ending. The meaning is in the 160 million years, in the Jurassic morning with the sauropods, in the Cretaceous evening with the hadrosaurs calling across the plain, in the first feathered theropod launching itself from a branch into the early Jurassic air. In all of it, in every moment of it, the full richness of life being lived. That is the story of the dinosaurs, and it is, when you look at it clearly and without flinching, one of the most beautiful stories ever told. Let it carry you now into sleep. Let the ancient world receive you. Let the weight of 66 million years rest on you like a blanket, heavy and warm and full of time. You are safe, you are held, you are part of the long story. Sleep. As we approach the close of our journey together tonight, let us spend these last quiet miles of the story not in facts and dates and names, but in something softer, in the quality of deep time itself, in the feeling of what it means to know that the world is old, and that life is persistent, and that even the most powerful seeming endings are also beginnings. Your body is very comfortable now. The events of your day are distant. The sounds of the night are quiet around you. Your breathing is slow and even, and with each breath, you're moving a little further from wakefulness and a little further toward rest. Think, if you will, of a single moment in the late Cretaceous, not the moment of the impact, as not the fire and the darkness, but a moment earlier, a quiet moment, an ordinary moment in a world that had no idea it was about to change. Somewhere in what will one day be Montana, the sun is setting over the Hell Creek floodplain. The sky is turning colours that have no names in any human language. Vast horizontal bands of orange and rose and deep violet, the clouds of the late Cretaceous towering in cumulonimbus formations that dwarf anything a modern observer would call a thunderstorm. The air smells of warm water and plant material, and the faint, clean scent of approaching rain. A hadrosaur herd is moving toward the water. Their footsteps are a soft, rhythmic percussion on the floodplain soil, and their low, resonant calls to one another carry across the plain in the still evening air. The adults keep the young ones close, guided by some ancient instinct that does not require thought, only presence. At the river's edge, a pair of triceratops are drinking. Their great heads are lowered, the long horns sweeping close to the water surface, and their eyes are half closed with the contentment of animals that have had a good day. Enough to eat, no predators in sight, water cool and clear. A small mammal, no larger than a rat, watches them from the shelter of a fern clump, its bright eyes wide and curious. In the trees above the river, a small avian dinosaur, something closely related to the modern birds that will descend from this lineage, is tucking its head beneath its wing as the light fails. Its feathers are iridescent in the last light, catching colours from a spectrum wider than human eyes can access. It makes a small, soft sound, almost like a sigh, and then is still. The triceratops finish drinking and move slowly back toward the forest. The hadrosaurs settle along the riverbank, some of them lying down, the young ones curling against the warmth of their parents' bodies. The small mammal retreats deeper into the ferns, the river murmurs. The night comes on gently. The stars emerge, and they are different stars. The Milky Way in a different configuration, the familiar constellations of the human sky not yet formed, the universe slightly different in its arrangement than it will be in 66 million years, but the stars are still the stars, the night is still the night. And somewhere, in the warmth and the dark and the slow breathing of the ancient world, the dinosaurs sleep. They are not afraid. Why would they be? They have been here for 160 million years. They have survived the Triassic-Jurassic extinction. They have survived changing climates and shifting continents, and the rise and fall of seas that no longer exist. They have adapted to every world the Earth has offered them, and the world has been good to them, and there is no reason in this warm Cretaceous night to imagine that it will not always be so. They sleep. And the stars turn overhead, and the Earth breathes its slow geological breath, and the moment that seems so permanent and so solid is already almost over, though no one and nothing in this peaceful scene can know that yet. This is what deep time does to us, when we let it. It shows us the fragility of the present moment. It shows us that everything we think of as permanent is, on the timescale of the Earth, a gesture, a breath, a brief arrangement of matter that will eventually become something else. And it shows us at the same time that this brevity is not a reason for despair, it is a reason for presence, for attention, for the full inhabitation of the moment we're actually living in, with the whole of our awareness and the full capacity of our senses. The dinosaurs could not have known they were living in a finite world. They simply lived. And in living for 160 million years, in filling the Earth with their extraordinary diversity, in building the ecosystems that would eventually support our own existence, in leaving their traces in every rock that has ever been read by curious human hands, they did something that deserves more than admiration. It deserves gratitude. Rest with that gratitude now, for the ancient world that made this one possible, for the 160 million year story of the dinosaurs, which is also, in a strange and indirect way, part of your own story, for the deep time that contains us all, without judgment, without urgency, in its vast and patient embrace. You are safe, you are warm, you are resting in a world built in part by giants. Let your eyes be still behind their lids. Let your breath come and go without effort. Let the images of the ancient world, the Jurassic forests, the Cretaceous plains, the sauropods moving through warm morning mist, the small feathered things tucking their heads beneath their wings as the stars emerge, let them carry you now, gently and without resistance, toward the deep and restful dark of sleep. The story is complete. The dinosaurs have told it fully. And now it is time to rest. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The night is deep and still around you now. Somewhere in the rock beneath wherever you rest, atoms are still arranged in the shapes of ancient bones. The long curved ribs of a sauropod that breathed its last 60 million years ago. The delicate finger bones of a small theropod that once caught insects in a Jurassic forest. the eggshell of a hadrosaur nest in a late Cretaceous riverside meadow. All of it is still here, in some form or another, changed, transformed, redistributed, but not gone. Matter is not lost, only rearranged. The calcium and the carbon and the iron of the ancient world are still cycling through the earth, still becoming new things, still participating in the great ongoing conversation between life and stone that has been happening since the first living cell divided in a warm Precambrian sea. You are part of that conversation. Your bones are the latest iteration of a form that has been refining itself for 500 million years. Your breath is moving atoms that have been breathed by animals whose names we will never know, whose worlds are visible to us only in the patient record of the rock. You do not need to hold any of this in your mind right now. You can let it go, all of it. The names, the dates, the great sweep of the story we have told together tonight. Let it dissolve, slowly, into the formless ease of approaching sleep. What remains, when the story is set aside, is something simpler and more fundamental. A sense of belonging, a sense of the great depth and richness of the world you inhabit, a quiet awareness that the ground beneath you is ancient and the sky above you is vast, and you are, in this moment, exactly where you need to be. Breathe. The dinosaurs breathed too in their ancient world, and in that breathing they were not so different from you, alive, present, participating in the mystery of existence with every molecule of their bodies. They are gone, and you are here, and between then and now, the earth has continued to turn, and life has continued to reach outward and inward and upward with its patient, irrepressible creativity. Rest now. The ancient world holds you. The night is good and deep. Sleep well. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us keep making more content. I'll see you in the next one. Good night.